Hey there, I'm Stephanie, and on this episode of Food Stories Told, I'm taking you back to a chat I had with Nate Scull in 2022. Nate used to work with Hermit Thrush Brewery in Brattleboro, Vermont, a place that was all about using what nature gives us to make some unique beers. Even though the brewery closed its doors in 2024, there's a lot we can learn from how they did things. In late 2022, I was researching how breweries worked with foraged ingredients. And that's when I first connected with Nate and the team. We talked about foraging, how they use these wild plants and ingredients, how things changed as they started brewing more and more, and how important it was to them to always respect nature. Nate shared stories about the challenges and adventures of brewing with what you can find in the wild. It was challenging, especially as they tried to grow, but it was important to them to stick to their roots and ensure they always did right by the environment. So, join me in this episode as we revisit my conversation with Nate and remember the lessons from Hermit Thrush Brewery. Sure, it's a story about beer, but really it's about the plants. It's also a reminder of how we can work with nature instead of against it, even as we grow.
Nate speaking.
Hey, Nate. Stephanie Gravalese here, and know you're big into foraging, and just wanted to ask you a couple questions about it. Obviously, using, Groot and some of the wild cereals, kind of even prehistoric, like us using wild things in beer, not new.
Foraged ingredients, old process, old way of doing things. Yeah.
How breweries are doing it, but also what are the challenges of using a wild, not commercially produced ingredient? Because I know there are some. Not sure if y'all are in production today or not, but thank you for chatting with me.
Yeah, no problem. I always love talking about what we're doing, and education has always been a huge part of what we do. So much for this.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, so one of the biggest challenges is the scalability. Wild harvesting an ingredient, it's hard to get the quantity that you need for the volume of beer that we are producing. So it's not something that can work for a large-scale manufacturing industry, especially if you're going to do it ethically. Foraging does have ethics involved in it. Don't take more than 10% of what you find. Otherwise, you're going to be wiping out a crop of something. They have a right to exist too. So finding the right amount to use, or the adequate amount to use, and ethically harvesting it can be challenging. Another challenge is finding someone who's willing to let you harvest. You can't just walk onto people's land and harvest. In Vermont, it's actually pretty easy compared to the rest of the country, I'd say. There's a really strong right to roam culture here, where most land is not posted, and if it's not posted, you're allowed to walk there. And frequently, if it's not posted, you can forage unless it expressly says no foraging. But you want to be respectful.
Absolutely, that is.
And
sorry, please go ahead. You're on
reaching out to landowners. I personally like to reach out to a landowner ahead of time, even if there is no sign, and I do feel the right to walk there. I still like to ask permission and offer a little token of thanks, a beer or something.
That's great. It's you bring up some very important points that usually are spoken about, obviously, in when folks are foraging and harvesting for themselves. But I'm curious, how does one strike that balance? Just really sticking by that 10% rule and just trying to go wide with your harvesting?
Well, we've gone further from wild harvesting and more toward, honestly, we're now at a scale where it's very difficult to ethically harvest wild ingredients.
Absolutely.
We just can't. For 30 barrel, that labor it takes would drive up the cost too higher than people would be willing to pay. Because, we're doing it by hand. We're going out and wild things. Or, for example, we just did last year we harvested wild, black walnuts from a walnut tree.
Yep.
No idea how much labor we were getting ourselves into when I harvested all that. It was so much work. And to appropriately price that from a business standpoint would make it astronomically expensive. So, we're just not going to do it. We're not going to make money off of that.
Yeah.
But, it was fun to experiment. But yeah, that makes it challenging from a business standpoint to do it at the scale that we're at. From a home brewer scale, I think it's totally viable and very easy to do.
Is that popular in home brewing to use foraged ingredients?
I think increasingly so.
Yeah. Cool.
Increasingly so, and regionally,
yep.
It's more popular than others. Some places just don't have the natural resources to go foraging, and that's where most people live and most people home brew. But out here in the sticks, there's plenty of ingredients around, and people are used to foraging for things as just a way of life anyway. It's just,
absolutely.
People hunt, they fish, and they forage in Vermont.
Absolutely.
I know plenty of people who hunt for wild mushrooms, and some of them also brew their own. It's like it's a cultural thing.
Yep.
So I think it's more ingrained in more rural areas. But I might be off the mark here. There's so many brewers out there in so many regions.
Absolutely. Growing up in Western Massachusetts, that was life. So
yeah.
But
it's interesting. I grew up in upstate New York, Binghamton area, and the things that I'm doing here, like foraging, things that my friends do, that's so foreign to them, to my friends back home. They think it's completely crazy and cool, but it's not part of the culture there.
Well, here's something that's fun. I was foraging along a few places, and I had a lot of folks, stop me and be like, "What are you doing there with that random plant?" And it was just total. But Troy, which is a smaller city nearby, just had their first foraging festival. So there are some folks in the capital region doing some fun stuff in foraging, which is, it feels like such a solitary act, but it's been cool to see some local things happening and not even upstate. It's not as cool to live in Albany than it is in the Catskills. So. But anyways, no, that's I definitely hear that as far as the connections I've talked to, speaking about that with any sort of. It's a really big piece of it. I'm a forager and I do a bit in agriculture, beer, agriculture, and food. So it's a, kind of that post-slavery, land use stuff that there's just so much that is, that impacts. So,
I think that, brewing is,
absolutely.
I know it is. It's an agricultural product. It's not viewed that way often. But it is. It's agriculturally grown malt and hops, and then we also extend that to other ingredients. Small farm stuff like pumpkins, and then just by extension, things like chaga mushrooms and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
So it's really beer should be rooted more in the agriculture side, and wild crafting is just part of agriculture.
100%. I'm definitely with you there. And the brewery's connection to foraging and wildcraft and all of that, but if you could just share sort of a top level. I know obviously you've transitioned more to agriculturally based products, but if you could just kind of share what, the connection to wildcraft and piece in that area, that would be super helpful as I intro y'all into the article.
Yeah. One of the challenges that I think is kind of unique to wild ingredients is that there's no laboratory information on the ingredients. When you're brewing with hops, they have analytics. They tell you how much alpha acid content is in there. So you know exactly what kind of bittering it's going to impart. With wild ingredients, there might not be any literature. There might be literature from the 18th century that says use a handful of this for some effect. So you really have to experiment, and there's risk incurred in that. You know, you don't know if this ingredient, when it's boiled, makes a really astringent taste or a really beautiful taste. And there's a lot of terroir differences. You know, if you harvest this mugwort near the river, it might taste very different and have a completely different characteristic than, you know, further up on the hill. So there's very little control in the outcome, which is fun and exciting and beautifully manufacturing facility, especially when we're talking about the biology, which is really what we're working with mixed culture sour beer. You know, some of these plants have effects on the bacteria. You know, like hops inhibit bacteria and can, if used incorrectly, cause our beer to not be sour. Some herbs and wild ingredients might have effects on the yeast. They might inhibit the yeast and cause a stalled fermentation. You know, there's some unknown things that it's not just like a flavor ingredient. It has an effect chemically on the beer as well. And sometimes it's unknown. There's unknown results. So that's a challenge.
That is a big challenge. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, not to get too nerdy, because obviously Thrillist is more consumer side, but I worked in manufacturing, food manufacturing for a little bit, but I just think about like your HACCP plate, you know, just the kind of processes you have to develop for something that is, you know, batch numbers and things for foraged ingredients. I got this on the square of land. It was Farmer Jones at X address. It's and especially where so many ingredients and extracts are, you know, tested and have literature behind them. That is a really good point.
Yeah, sometimes we have to dive into literature that does not pertain to brewing and try to extrapolate how it applies to us. It's just difficult. It's really difficult. And we have to make smaller batches to make sure that, you know, if something goes wrong, you know, it's not a huge loss.
Absolutely.
So we tend to do our forage stuff for many reasons that I listed above as small batch. It's just like so much fun to go forage. Like that feels like such a field trip when we get to go like forage spruce tips for a beer. Like it just feels like a holiday. It's great.
Well, if you ever need an extra set of hands, I mean, I got to come up anyways, but if you guys ever need an extra set of hands, it sounds like a pretty fun, you know, an important, you know, connection to what y'all do.
Oh, yeah.
That's wonderful. No, I feel like we could talk all afternoon about this, and I also want to be respectful of your time. Thanks again, Nate. I appreciate it.
Cheers. Thanks for calling.
Absolutely.
And, talk soon.
Thanks. Talk soon. Bye.